When Field Marshal Kesselring received the flash priority message in the early hours of March 23rd, he didn't scream. He didn't demand an immediate counteroffensive. He simply sat in the dim light of his command bunker, staring at a single name on a map: Oppenheim. What he whispered to his chief of staff in that moment was never recorded in the official war diaries. It wasn't a military assessment. It was the sound of a man watching a 2,000-year-old myth evaporate. For months, the German High Command had been operating under a specific, comfortable delusion, a belief that there was a right way to fight this war, and that their enemy was too disciplined, too bureaucratic, and too slow to break the rules. Kesselring looked at the report again. The impossible had happened. It hadn't happened with a massive bombardment or a weeks-long buildup. It had happened in the dead of night, in total silence, spearheaded by a man the Germans feared more than any other Allied general. The man across the river wasn't playing the game of kings anymore. He was playing for blood. As the sun began to rise over the Rhine, the highest-ranking officers in the Third Reich realized that the final barrier wasn't just broken, it was irrelevant. But to understand how a single river crossing shattered the psychological spine of the German army, we need to go back 48 hours to the moment they thought they had already won. At this point, the German High Command believed the situation was stable. The Rhine wasn't just a river to them, it was a psychological fortress. For centuries, it had been the watch on the Rhine, a geographical god that protected the heart of Germany. The maps in the bunker showed a thick blue line that no army in modern history had ever successfully breached without months of meticulous preparation. Their intelligence was perfect. They were watching the British to the north. They saw Field Marshal Montgomery gathering 1 million men, thousands of guns, and a massive fleet of specialized landing craft. That was the threat they understood. That was the predictable enemy. The German generals felt a grim sense of confidence. They had timed the British down to the hour. They knew exactly when the artillery would start. They had prepared their defenses for a massive, slow-moving hammer blow. They believed that if they could hold the Rhine, they could force a stalemate, perhaps even a separate peace. The system was working. Orders were being followed. The Rhine was the one thing they still owned in a collapsing world. What none of them realized was how fatal that confidence had become. While they were staring through binoculars at the British tanks in the north, a shadow was moving in the south. A shadow that didn't care about proper military procedure. Then the reports stopped lining up. A junior officer at a small, sleepy outpost near Oppenheim sent a frantic message about rubber boats. It was laughed off. The commanders at headquarters didn't even bother to wake the generals. How could it be an invasion? There was no preliminary artillery barrage. There were no paratroopers filling the sky. The American Third Army, led by George Patton, was supposed to be low on fuel, bogged down, and strictly ordered by the Allied Supreme Command to wait for the British. The German staff assumed the Americans were too professional to disobey their own superiors. But one detail didn't match the rest: the sound. Usually, an army crossing a river sounds like the end of the world. But at Oppenheim, the German sentries reported hearing nothing but the rhythmic, eerie splashing of oars. A colonel in the German 7th Army dismissed it as a localized patrol, a minor nuisance. He refused to move his reserves. He didn't want to look foolish by reacting to a phantom threat. That decision would haunt the German High Command for the rest of their lives. Because while the staff officers were debating whether the reports were credible, the Moat was being turned into a bridgehead. By the time they realized the reports were real, it was already too late to stop the first wave. Instead of slowing down or securing their perimeter, the Americans did something the Germans found militarily insane. They didn't wait for air cover. They didn't wait for heavy tanks. They just kept coming. Every 90 seconds, it seemed, a new report hit Kesselring's desk, each one more chaotic than the last. The German commanders faced a brutal choice: admit they had been completely bypassed and pull forces away from the real battle in the north, or stay the course and hope this was just a diversion. They chose to double down. Kesselring ordered his troops to hold their ground, believing that an army as reckless as Patton's would eventually run out of steam and be crushed by its own overextension. It was a gamble born of pride. To move the reserves now would be to admit that the Americans had outthought them. It would be an admission that the Rhine, their sacred barrier, was already gone. Instead of retreating to better defensive positions, they threw their remaining local units into a meat grinder, trying to erase the mistake before it reached the ears of Berlin. That's when the situation crossed the point of no return. The Americans weren't just crossing. They were building a massive, multi-lane bridge under the cover of smoke. The Moat had been conquered, and the German high command was still arguing about whether the water was even wet. This is the moment that never made it into the propaganda reels. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere in the German headquarters shifted from frustration to a cold, paralyzing dread. In the private diaries of the officers present, a terrifying realization began to emerge. They weren't just losing a battle, they were losing their understanding of the enemy. They had always viewed the Americans as businessmen in uniform, logical, cautious, and afraid of casualties. But at Oppenheim, they saw something else. They saw a commander who was willing to throw the rulebook into the river if it meant moving 5 miles faster. Whispers began to circulate among the staff. If they can do this without artillery, what else can they do? Behind those closed doors, Kesselring reportedly looked at his maps and realized the war in the West was over. Not because of numbers, but because of spirit. Patton had bypassed their impenetrable defense with rubber boats and a total lack of fear. The German generals started to see Patton not as a general, but as a force of nature, something they couldn't plan for or predict. One officer wrote that night, "We are fighting a man who does not know how to wait." But Kesselring didn't say it out loud. Not yet. He still had to pretend there was a plan. He had to keep the illusion of control alive for a few more hours. From that moment on, nothing moved the same way again. The Rhine crossing at Oppenheim acted like a pulled thread that unraveled the entire German sweater. Because the high command had refused to believe the initial reports, their response was disjointed and frantic. Orders became reactions. Strategy became survival. The 7th Army, once a formidable fighting force, was split in two. The impregnable river line was now a sieve. The human cost was staggering, not just in lives, but in the total collapse of morale. German soldiers who had been told for years that the Rhine was the ultimate wall saw American jeeps racing past them into the heart of Germany. The strategic collapse was total. By bypassing the expected massive invasion in the north, Patton had turned the entire German defensive plan into a pile of useless paper. They were now fighting a war on 3 sides with no way to move their troops. And this wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that the news of the quiet crossing reached the other Allied commanders. Now everyone was racing to be the next one across. The floodgates hadn't just been opened, they had been ripped off their hinges. This wasn't just a tactical decision, it was the moment the German high command realized that power has limits. For 12 years, they believed that willpower and superior strategy could overcome any obstacle. They believed they could dictate how the war would end. But at Oppenheim, they saw the truth. They saw that an enemy they had dismissed as soft was actually more flexible, more daring, and more aggressive than they were. The Rhine crossing revealed the fundamental flaw in the German military ego. They were so convinced of their own brilliance that they couldn't imagine an enemy who would simply ignore their defenses. What was permanently lost that night wasn't just a riverbank or a few towns. It was the German belief in their own inevitability. The myth of the Watch on the Rhine was replaced by the reality of an American army that was moving faster than the German staff could even process information. They realized that the war was no longer a chess match. It was a landslide, and they were at the bottom of the mountain. This leaves us with a question that historians still can't agree on. Was the crossing at Oppenheim a stroke of military genius? A daring gamble that saved thousands of lives by ending the war weeks earlier? Or was it a moment of pure, reckless ego? A general who ignored his superiors and bypassed safety protocols just to beat his rivals to the headlines? Some say Patton's quiet crossing was the ultimate expression of modern leadership under pressure. Others argue it was a dangerous fluke that succeeded only because the German command was already paralyzed by their own bureaucracy. Was this a masterclass in psychological warfare? Or did the German high command simply defeat themselves by refusing to believe the truth until it was too late? The records are conflicting, and the men who were in that bunker that night took most of their secrets to the grave. What do you think? Did Patton win because he was better, Or did the Germans lose because they were too arrogant to listen to their own sentries? Let us know in the comments. The debate is still wide open.